In yesterday's chapter, we saw Naomi bury all the men in her life. They all die. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, everything Naomi had ever known and loved is buried in the ground. And suddenly she's alone. Or at least that's how she feels. At the end of chapter 1, we saw her head back to her own home in Israel, and Ruth, one of Naomi's Moabite daughters-in-law, a woman of remarkable character, accompanies Naomi. When the two of them arrive, Naomi says, in fact, "God has turned his hand against me. I left here full and I came back empty. I've got nothing. I've got no one. I have no food on the table. I have no roof over my head. I have no hope for the future. I am alone here." Now, she is blinded by her grief and is absolutely understandable, but notice that the narrator will not leave us with the impression that Naomi is right. She's not without help, and she's not without hope. Just look at the last verse of chapter 1. In fact, verse 21, Naomi says, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." But verse 22, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth, the Moabite. She's not alone, and she is not empty, despite what she says, how she feels, or what she thinks. They arrived in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. And so hope is on the horizon, whether she sees it or not. The narrator here is trying to clue us in on something. I really want you to see this early on. The point of the book of Ruth is that there is always a bigger story unfolding. There is a greater power at work. Our joys and even our sorrows play out in the palm of God's hand. He really is in control of all things. And by the end of this chapter, even Naomi will start to see that that is true. And so, in Ruth chapter 2, immediately we are introduced to a man called Boaz. He is a relative of the family, in fact, from the tribe of Judah, in the clan of Naomi's late husband. And as verse 1 puts it, he is a man of standing. He's decent. He's honourable. He's a man of integrity. Now, here's how we know he's a man of integrity. The Old Testament law in Deuteronomy chapter 24 tells us that when people are harvesting their fields, they should deliberately not harvest right to the edges of the fields. They should leave some of its produce for the foreigner and for the fatherless and for the widow. Now, Boaz is a landowner in this era, and as we're about to find out, he actually does this. He actually obeys God's law. He chooses not to squeeze every inch of his land for every bit of profit he can generate, but instead he does leave some of these resources out in the fields so that some of the poor can come and help themselves. Now that is not a given at this point in Israel's history. I hope you know that. During the time of the judges, when everyone does what is right in their own eyes, this man, Boaz, does what is right in God's eyes. Isn't that interesting? It doesn't benefit him one bit to actually do this, materially at least. It's not for his good that he's obedient here, but for the good of the poor and the vulnerable. So Boaz loves God, and he loves God's people, and therefore Boaz is obedient even when it costs him. And that is going to make all the difference in this beautiful story. So then Ruth, aware of this provision for the poor in Israel, she goes out to pick up scraps of food from the corner of a stranger's field. Now, it's easy in our minds to romanticize this part of the story. You might imagine a lovely sunny day, a wide open field bursting with grain, a gentle breeze, the sun rippling through the barley. It's like an advert for Quaker Oats or something. But in reality, this is like the equivalent of collecting tin cans off the street and taking them to the recycling centre in exchange for a few pennies. This is strenuous, sweaty, very humble work. The pay is low and the risk is high, especially to a vulnerable woman like Ruth, with no husband, no father, no Israelite tribe to call her own. Verse 3, so she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just as it turned out. Don't you love that phrase? It's kind of dripping with irony. You know how the story develops over the next couple of chapters. You know that in time, Ruth and this man, Boaz, will develop a relationship. They will fall in love. They will get married and they will have a child. Ruth, the Moabite, who is at this moment without a penny and without position and without power or prestige at all, she will be the great-grandmother of the greatest king in Israel's history, King David. And of course, from the line of David comes Jesus Christ himself, the Son of God and Savior of the world. The whole history of the human race rises and falls on Ruth's journey to work that day. The eternal destiny of billions of people hangs in the balance of one field being chosen over the other. Of course, it is not a coincidence. It's not that it just so happened or it turned out this way by chance. This is not a stroke of luck, but rather the sovereign hand of God at work to turn all things, all of them, the big and the seemingly small, to the good of his people and the glory of his name.